right, in this episode, we are covering Alma chapters 43 to 52. This is part 1 of those chapters. Chapter 43 shows us yet again another dissension from the Nephites. We've gone over this several times, but this theme just comes back over and over again. This dissension from the land of liberty, so to speak, the land of the reign of the judges, and the land of the doctrine of Christ. And we see this lining up again here with the Zoramites. Remember, we just left the Zoramites with Alma and Shiblon and Corianton and Amulek and others that were there teaching the Zoramites. They convert many of the poor Zoramites who go over to the land of Jershon with the anti-Nephi-Lehi's. But those that remain are furious with the Nephites. And we're going to go over time and again how this duality of the message of Mormon and the entire Book of Mormon, really, especially the portions that he has abridged, are about the doctrine of Christ, number one, and number two, they're about liberty. They're about liberty within government. Why is this such a prevalent theme for Mormon? Why is this something he's pushing so hard? They seem to go together. And we're going to get into that a little bit with what we call the ancient law of liberty. But starting off here in chapter 43, we have Alma and his sons, presumably including Corianton, go out and they begin preaching around the lands of the Nephites again to reestablish yet again the church. And then in verse 4, as we pay attention to the text throughout the Book of Mormon, we see who the Nephites are and who the Lamanites are. These are not just descendants of the sons of Lehi, right? These are political groups. So in verse 4 here, we get, "For behold, it came to pass that the Zoramites became Lamanites." So let's rehearse here who has become Lamanites in the past. We have the Amalekites, right, who may or may not be the Amalekites. We have others likely that were of the order of Nehor that have gone over to the Lamanites. We have the Amalekites who have gone over to the Lamanites. They are now Lamanites, right? And then we have now the Zoramites. What is it that we have in common with each of these groups? Number one, they have all dissented from the Nephites. Number two, that dissension is based primarily in the doctrine of Christ. These are religious groups. And so this division that we get is based on the doctrine of Christ. You believe in Christ, you are in the land of the Nephites. You don't believe in Christ, you are with the Lamanites. Theologically speaking, that is the great divide. And then there's one more great divide that we're going to get to as we bring up Captain Moroni here. So we continue in verse 4 here. It says, "Therefore in the commencement of the 18th year, the people of the Nephites saw that the Lamanites were coming upon them. Therefore they made preparations for war. Yea, they gathered together their armies in the land of Jershon." Remember that the land of the Zoramites, Antionum, right, and the land of Jershon are right there on the southern border. So that is their border, so to speak, with the Lamanites. So probably a land of kind of a demilitarized zone. The DMZ, so to speak, would be maybe that land of Siron, right? That we talked about in the last episode. That would sit there between the two sides. And it says, "And it came to pass that the Lamanites came with their thousands, and they came into the land of Antionum." Well, this is where the Zoramites are. This is the land of the Zoramites, which is the land of the Zoramites, and a man by the name of Zerahemnah was their leader. And let's go ahead and follow up in verse 6 here. It says, "And now as the Amalekites," different group, "were of a more wicked and murderous disposition than the Lamanites were," the dissenters always are, "in and of themselves, therefore Zerahemnah appointed chief captains over the Lamanites, and they were all Amalekites and Zoramites." So you have the Nephite leaders here who are now Lamanites, are the ones that are leading the army against the Nephites. And that's the way it almost always is. the dissenters rally and stir up the Lamanites to go to war against the Nephites. And what drives them? Verse 7. Now this he did that he might preserve the hatred toward the Nephites, that he might bring them into subjection to the accomplishment of his design. And what are his designs? It says, for behold, his designs were to stir up the Lamanites to anger against the Nephites. This he did that he might usurp great power over them. This is our second point. This is liberty versus tyranny. And also that he might gain power over the Nephites by bringing them into bondage. And we're going to get the exact opposite here. And this is, again, a very central point of the Book of Mormon. It doesn't seem like it's this spiritual, theological thing, but it is a temporal, practical, key ingredient to life in our probationary state. It says here in verse 9, and now the design of the Nephites, juxtaposed to Zerahemnah here, was to support their lands and their houses and their wives and their children, that they might preserve them from the hands of their enemies, and also that they might preserve their rights and their privileges, yea, and also their liberty, that they might worship God according to their desires. Now this is key right here. This is very important. Verse 10. For they knew that if they should fall into the hands of the Lamanites, that whosoever should worship God in spirit and in truth, the true and the living God, the Lamanites would destroy. Right? So they knew that this tyranny meant that they were going to have to give up the worship of God. They were going to have to give up their religion. So this is very interesting, right? We have those that are not Christian-based that are going to come against those that are Christian-based. Those that want tyranny over the others, and those that want freedom for themselves and for others. That's the battle. Now, the other group that we would throw in here with the Lamanites, that became Lamanites also, are the descendants of the priests of Noah. And of course, with them, it's the exact same thing, right? They want tyranny over the Nephites. They want to destroy their church. They want to destroy the doctrine of Christ. So very clearly here, as we go into the war chapters, what are they battling over? They're battling over religion, specifically the doctrine of Christ, and they're battling over freedom versus tyranny. So Captain Moroni is introduced to us here. He's 25 years old. He is a military and spiritual stud. He's appointed by the people. It's very clear that these things are outlined over and over again, that this is designed by the people of the Nephites. And he gathers his armies in the land of Jershon, where the anti-Nephi-Lehies were, right? Them and the poor Zoramites were moved to the land of Melech. Jershon is too close to the border. Now here's what starts to happen here. Zerahemnah leads his armies up toward the land of Jershon, and they see that the Nephite army is very well prepared with breastplates and arm plates and helmets. They're ready to go. And most of the Lamanites, right, are nearly naked with a loincloth, and others don't have any of this protective material on them. So they decide they're going to go somewhere else where it's a little bit easier to conquer another small town, a less defended town. They're going to go after the weak. So Moroni leaves a portion of his army there in the land of Jershon, and he goes to Alma and asks him what's going to go on here. Just like Nephi went to Lehi and asked him, where should I go to hunt? Right? The generals of the Nephites, they go to the prophet, and they ask, where do we go? And so he goes over by the riverside and into a valley with a portion of his army, awaiting the Lamanites. And this is brought up over and over again by Alma/Mormon. What are they there for? They are there to defend their lands and their country, their rights and their liberties. Therefore, they were prepared against the time of the coming of the Lamanites. Now, what is backing up that statement? A big part of what is backing up that statement is being here in the 18th year of the reign of the judges is a representative government. It's a freedom of the Nephites to be able to elect their own judges and own representatives. That is the core of their liberty in their land, and the laws that allow for anyone to believe what they want to believe. I think sometimes about what would have happened if the angel that came to Alma the Younger, when he was persecuting the church, remember, he was with the sons of Mosiah. If that would not have happened, then Mosiah, when he gave up the throne, would have given up the throne to one of those 4 sons who were wicked. And what a change we would have had with all of Nephite history. They may have never made it much further than this. But because of that visitation, the sons of Mosiah decline to take the throne. And then we have the monarchy that turns into a representative government with the reign of the judges. And there's more liberty that is given to the people, which is a scary thing. But this is what they are fighting for. They are fighting for this representative government. They are fighting for the freedom of religion. And again, and I'm going to go over these every time I see them. It says here in verse 29, "And now as Moroni knew the intention of the Lamanites, that it was their intention to destroy their brethren, or to subject them and to bring them into bondage, that they might establish a kingdom unto themselves over all the land. And he also knowing that it was the only desire of the Nephites to preserve their lands and their liberty and their church. Therefore he thought it no sin that he should defend them by stratagem." And we know with Moroni, he's going to get very strategic against the Lamanites. So something important here with kind of the rules of war are that they're not going out to conquer other lands, right? They're defending. They're in a position of defense. So Moroni, knowing the plans of the Lamanites through his spies, sends out one of his commanders, Lehi, to come about to the rear of the army of the Lamanites. And as the Lamanite army approaches the river Sidon on the east bank, Lehi's troops come up to him on the rear. And the Lamanite army turns and starts fighting against Lehi and his men. And so because the Lamanites are more prepared in their war garb, they force the Lamanites toward the river. And the Lamanites end up running, in a sense, going across the river to this valley, which is right on the west bank. And that's where Moroni's troops are. So Lehi remains on the east bank of the river Sidon, and Moroni's men start falling upon the Lamanite army. And it's a very brutal battle. But it's brought up here in verse 45 again. "Nevertheless, the Nephites were inspired by a better cause. For they were not fighting for monarchy nor power, but they were fighting for their homes and their liberties, their wives and their children, and their all, yea, for their rights of worship and their church." So we can see what their motives are and how many times this comes up, right? It's liberty and their church. It's their worship. And again, their cause was contending with the Lamanites to defend themselves and their families and their lands, their country and their rights and their religion. They keep going back to this over and over and over again. Now, one reason may be is because they want to show that they are in a position of defense, and that gives them the higher moral ground. They're not trying to bring tyranny to the Lamanites. They're not trying to conquer the Lamanites. They're not trying to get a tributary from them, a tax. Right? They're just defending what is theirs. But again, it's religion comes up over, and their rights come up over and over again. They know that that's going to be removed. We get this in verse 49 here as this brutal battle's happening, that the armies from Moroni, they cried with one voice unto the Lord their God. So what had probably happened here is, we don't know the rules of engagement here back in that period of time, but they had probably come together and they had made a covenant of war at that point. And that's why it says, and they cried with one voice unto the Lord their God. Well, why are they crying unto the Lord? They're making a covenant, right? They may have pulled back from each other to give each other a rest in their battles or something to that effect. May have both drawn back in the battle, the Lamanites and the army of Moroni. And that's when the army of Moroni cries with one voice unto the Lord for their liberty and their freedom from bondage. And so the army of Moroni battles fiercely and pushes them back into or toward the river Sidon. And then, of course, they get back there and they realize that Lehi is still there on the east bank of the river. So they are surrounded and they're struck with terror, we're told. And now again, when they're surrounded, Moroni says, halt. We're going to stop here for a second, right? Again, the moral high ground here. And he says to Zerahemnah, behold, Zerahemnah, that we do not desire to be men of blood. Ye know that ye are in our hands, yet we do not desire to slay you. Behold, we have not come out to battle against you, that we might shed your blood for power. Neither do we desire to bring anyone to the yoke of bondage. Right? Slavery is a common thing. But this is the very cause for which ye have come against us. Yea, ye are angry with us because of our religion. Right? I think oftentimes we go through the Book of Mormon and we don't pick this up. It's not just a battle of, we want to conquer you. It is a religious war. Part of the hate toward the Nephites is their Christianity. Nobody on the side of the Lamanites is Christian. Nobody believes in Christ. And the Lamanites want to wipe that out. They want to wipe out the doctrine of Christ. So Moroni says, look, Zerahemnah, we're going to hold off on battling here with you anymore. We've got you surrounded, but we're going to let you go if you'll turn over your weapons first, and second, that you'll make a covenant that you will never come back to battle against us. Well, Zerahemnah is furious about this. He says, look, I'll give you our weapons if you let us go, but I am not making an oath that we're not going to come back to battle against you, because we know we will. Right? That hatred is seething within them. And Zerahemnah says to Moroni, behold, we are not of your faith. So Moroni, where they have collected a lot of these weapons of war already from Zerahemnah's men, they give them back. They give them back their weapons so that it's a fairer fight. And he says, look, you're not going anywhere until you make an oath. This kid's 25. And they begin to battle with him again. And the Lamanites are very fierce. They fight valiantly. A lot of Nephites fall by the sword. But while they're battling, one of the Nephite men strikes Zerahemnah with his sword and cuts off his scalp. And then he picks up the scalp, puts it on the end of his sword, and holds it up. And this is very interesting. And this whole episode is very covenant-centric. And this soldier holds up the sword with a scalp and he says, even as this scalp has fallen to the earth, which is the scalp of your chief, so shall ye fall to the earth, except ye will deliver up your weapons of war and depart with a covenant of peace. Right? So this is, again, parallelism. What he is saying here, they're talking about a covenant. They wouldn't make the covenant of peace before, the Lamanites. He's asking them to make the covenant again now. And see, there is a consequence with covenants. And we've talked about this as well. But again, you go back to the Hittites and other ancient Middle Eastern civilizations. When you make a covenant, you cut it. Karat berit. Well, that cut scalp is what is cut. Right? Later, we're going to get the cut coat or garment of Moroni. It's the same thing. And as he says here, what has happened with this scalp as it fell to the earth is going to happen to you is exactly how a covenant is made. Right? They're going to slit the throat of an animal when they make the covenant, even in a sacrifice with the Jews. It's making a covenant. They're cutting a covenant. And what they're going to say along with that oftentimes in this covenant making, not always with the sacrifices perhaps, but in this covenant making is, If I don't follow through on this, may what has happened to this animal happen to me. And maybe the animal's cut in half or in several pieces. That's how the covenant is made. That's the punishment that goes along with the covenant. That should be something very familiar to many of you that went through the temple before 1990, 1991-ish, right? It's symbolic of the consequence. It's not actually complete without that, anciently. So many of the men of Zerahemnah end up turning in their swords and making a covenant not to return to fight against them. But Zerahemnah is still furious, so he rallies the rest of the army. They start to fight, but they just start falling quickly. And so Zerahemnah sees he's going to die. And so finally he stops and agrees to make the covenant. And they all take the bodies that have fallen here and they put them in the river. There's just too many of them to bury. And they let them go down the river, into the sea, it says. Too many to count. All right, now what we've had so far, up through chapter 44 there, that we were just quoting, is the record of Alma. And now we're going to move into the record of his son Helaman. So even though we're still here for another 20 or more or less chapters in the book of Alma, the rest of the record here in the book of Alma is from Alma's son Helaman. And now, as you recall, when Alma back in chapter 36 and beyond was talking to his son Helaman, and it told him he was entrusting the records unto him, he kind of goes through this again here. He revisits this conversation, and he says to Helaman, "Believest thou the words which I spake unto thee concerning those records which have been kept?" And Helaman said unto him, "Yea, I believe." And then he asks him this again. And Alma said again, "Believest thou in Jesus Christ, who shall come?" And he said, "Yea, I believe all the words which thou hast spoken." And Alma asks him, "Will ye keep my commandments?" This is kind of like the Savior talking to Peter. And Helaman says, "I will keep thy commandments with all my heart." And then he prophesies, some of which cannot be written by Helaman. But he prophesies and he has Helaman write this down. It says, "Behold, I perceive that this very people, the Nephites, according to the spirit of revelation which is in me, in 400 years from the time that Jesus shall manifest himself unto them, shall dwindle in unbelief. Yea, and then shall they see wars and pestilences, yea, famines and bloodsheds, even until the people of Nephi shall become extinct." And he goes on to say that the Lamanites will still be around, but a number of the Nephites that are left over will be considered Lamanites, and those that are valiant are going to be hunted down. And then we're told that Alma leaves after he's had this talk with his son, and that he goes toward the land of Melech. But it says, "And it came to pass that he was never heard of more. As to his death or burial, we know not of." Right? This is Helaman writing this. And then he speculates on whether he was transfigured, kind of like Moses was. And we get from Helaman now the same exact problem. The same thing starts to happen. Let's read this text closely here. It says, starting in verse 20 here, this is chapter 45. "And now it came to pass in the commencement of the 19th year," so this is the following year after the war with Zerahemnah. It says that the people of Nephi, that Helaman went among the people of the Nephi to declare the word unto them. For behold, because of their wars with the Lamanites and the many little dissensions and disturbances which had been among the people. So we keep getting this peeling off, right, from the Nephites. Dissensions, right? We keep getting this peeling off, it seems to me, more and more over to the Lamanites. And what's the point of contention? It's the doctrine of Christ. And it says that even after now Helaman has reestablished, him and his brethren have reestablished the church in the land, it says, "There arose a dissension among them, and they would not give heed to the words of Helaman and his brethren." Here we go again. "But they grew proud, being lifted up in their hearts because of their exceedingly great riches." This is like the Zoramites. "Therefore they grew rich in their own eyes and would not give heed to their words to walk uprightly before God." We just get this hatred that just keeps building up against these preachers, Helaman and his brethren, and those that are preaching Christ. We go over to chapter 46, and it came to pass that as many as would not hearken to the words of Helaman and his brethren were gathered together against their brethren. We got this with Nehor, we got this with Amlici, we get this with the Zoramites. Keeps happening. There is a constant sifting, right, of the wheat and the chaff. It says, and now behold, they were exceedingly wroth, insomuch that they were determined to slay them. Now the leader of those who were wroth against their brethren was a large and a strong man. That's how they described Nehor. That's how they described Amlici. And his name was, interestingly enough, Amalekiah. Right? I would recommend you go back and look at the episode that I did on the Amlicites, the Amalekites, and the Amalekiahites. Almost all the same name. And of course, what does Amalekiah want? He wants to destroy the doctrine of Christ, and he wants to destroy liberty. Verse 4 immediately, and Amalekiah was desirous to be king. And most of those that supported him were the lower judges of the land, and they were seeking for power. So the government of the people are turning on the government and on the people at large. Right? They are the lower judges, so they want a higher power. They are not there to represent. They are there for power, for political power. Do you see that in any of our politicians today? Nah. And again, it's not that Amalekiah just wants to be king. Here in verse 10, he sought to destroy the church of God and to destroy the foundation of liberty which God had granted unto them. Again, very tightly brought together here, the doctrine of Christ and liberty. Think about why that might be. So Amalekiah is very flattering, and he starts to gather a lot of recruits and people that leave the church and want to support Amalekiah to become a king. They want to revert back to a monarchy. And so Moroni gets wind of this, and he's furious again about this. So what does he do? And it came to pass that he rent his coat. This is great. And he took a piece thereof and wrote upon it, in memory of our God, our religion, and freedom, and our peace, our wives, and our children, and he fastened it upon the end of a pole. This all has to do with covenant. A ripped coat, he rent the coat. This is a karat berit, right? This is a cutting a covenant. And he put on his whole battle regalia here, his head plate and his breastplate and his shields, girded on his armor and about his loins, and he took the pole which had on the end thereof his rent coat, and he called it the title of liberty. And he bowed himself to the earth, and he prayed mightily unto his God for the blessings of liberty to rest upon his brethren, so long as there should be a band of Christians remain to possess the land. So this is the first time we get this term here in the Book of Mormon. And why do we get the term? Because those that are with Amalekiah, again, they're against the doctrine of Christ. Everybody is against the doctrine of Christ. So those that would remain fighting against Amalekiah, this new dissension, or that would fight against the Lamanites, they're the Christians. Verse 14, for thus were all the true believers of Christ who belonged to the church of God, called by those who did not belong to the church. So you can see where the Amalekites, this is obviously the Amalekiahites now, the new dissenters. They're calling their enemies Christians, which is likely what the early Christians, where they got their name, were from their enemies after the time of Christ. And so the ones that are really behind all of this here with the Nephites are members of the church. And they were glad to take upon them this name. But again, this is the dividing line. And in 16, I'll repeat it again, and therefore at this time Moroni prayed that the cause of the Christians and the freedom of the land might be favored. This is the theme throughout the Book of Mormon. Why do you think that would be? Why do we have these two themes in the Book of Mormon? If the Book of Mormon is written for our time, and these are the two major messages from the Book of Mormon, we might think about how those two go together and where the attacks will eventually come from or do come from, and how we might see people lining up, right? Those that would believe in the doctrine of Christ, and those that would believe in liberty, and those that believe in tyranny, and those that would want to destroy the doctrine of Christ. And then he makes a declaration here in his prayer. He says, he named all the land which was south of the land desolation, yea, and in fine all the land both on the north and on the south, a chosen land and the land of liberty. So as he goes out here soon, where, keep that in mind, where the Lamanites start taking over some of these cities, Moroni has already put a stand down on all of this. He has already put down what the land of liberty is, and he's going to fight till he gets it all back. And so Moroni goes out after he makes this prayer, waving the rent part of his garment in the air, that all might see the writing which he had written upon the rent part, and crying with a loud voice, saying, Behold, whosoever will maintain this title upon the land, let them come forth in the strength of the Lord, and enter into a covenant, that they will maintain their rights and their religion, that the Lord God may bless them. So we get a central point of covenant here. And not just any covenant, but a Josephite covenant. He follows up and says, And it came to pass that when Moroni had proclaimed these words, behold, the people came running together with their armor, girded about their loins, rending their garments in token, or as a covenant, karat berit, that they would not forsake the Lord their God. And these are important words for all of us here who have made covenants. Or in other words, if they should transgress the commandments of God, or fall into transgression, and be ashamed to take upon them the name of Christ, the Lord should rend them, this is like the scalp, the Lord should rend them even as they had rent their garments. So again, those who had gone through the temple before 91, 90-ish will recognize that, right? This is how covenants were made anciently. There had to be a consequence to it. And then this becomes very interesting to me. It says here in 22, Now this was the covenant which they made, and they cast their garments at the feet of Moroni. This to me seems very familiar. So they're casting their garments out. Now, is Moroni just standing there? That's what we usually have in mind. He's just standing there, maybe. What is he doing? Is he on a horse? Well, we don't have any records of him riding on a horse. So he's standing there with his title of liberty. So I just wonder on this, just my own thoughts here, if we're not looking at some type of a procession or something that would be similar to what we see in the procession at the Triumphal Entry of Christ. Remember what we get there. We have Christ coming in and everyone putting their garments, laying their garments down in front of him. I would guess from that, from the Book of Mormon here, from what we get here, that there is covenant being made. And that's why I say I don't think that the people at the time of Christ that were waving the palms, which would be something from the very possibly the Day of Atonement and the Feast of Tabernacles, were the same ones, the same Jews in Jerusalem during the Passover that were supporting his death. And a lot of times that's what we get, right? I mean, that doesn't mean that some people didn't cross over. I think that the band of Christians was small compared to the vast majority of all those who had come into Jerusalem for the Passover and that supported what the high priests were saying and the Pharisees and the Sadducees. But they laid out their garments in that procession, right? They threw out their coats, their robes. So we might look at that as some type of a covenant that was being made. That's what's happening here. It says here in verse 22, again, we get this idea of karat berit and the punishment of a covenant. It says, we covenant with our God that we shall be destroyed, even as our brethren in the land northward. if we shall fall into transgression. Yea, he may cast us at the feet of our enemies, even as we cast our garments at thy feet, to be trodden underfoot, if we shall fall into transgression. So Moroni is not just standing there with the title of liberty and everybody throws everything at his feet. He is marching, right? Maybe there's people behind him and it's a type of march or procession that is happening here. Maybe this is ritualistic, and it might even have something to do with the temple. But we're definitely getting a very rich covenant scene here, and it gets richer. Moroni says unto them, Behold, we are a remnant of the seed of Jacob. Yea, we are a remnant of the seed of Joseph, whose coat was rent by his brethren into many pieces. So again, this is a very Josephite, as we have learned even more recently, a very Josephite tribe are the Nephites. And they have writings in the brass plates that may not have been prevalent throughout the other writings of the Old Testament, because they come from the land, the northern kingdom, from Manasseh and from Ephraim. And he continues, Yea, and now behold, let us remember to keep the commandments of God, or our garments shall be rent by our brethren, and we be cast into prison, or be sold, or be slain. Yea, let us preserve our liberty as a remnant of Joseph. Yea, let us remember the words of Jacob before his death. For behold, he saw that a part of the remnant of the coat of Joseph was preserved and had not decayed. And he said, this is Jacob, even as this remnant of garment of my son hath been preserved. Right, this is the coat of many colors. This is a priesthood coat. So shall a remnant of the seed of my son be preserved by the hand of God. This is powerful. And be taken unto himself, while the remainder of the seed of Joseph shall perish, even as the remnant of his garment. So they're saying, look, we're not saying we want to be a part of that remnant, right? Much of the remnant of Joseph was possibly destroyed from the Assyrians before the time of Lehi. But he's saying, look, we want to be righteous and we want to be a part of that remnant. So this title of liberty that I have, in a sense, think of it as a part of the coat of many colors. And their garments, their coats that they throw to the ground to be trodden on are like the coat of many colors, which was ripped apart by wild beasts in the pit, which was pulled apart by his brethren, by Joseph's brethren. And a remnant was brought back to their father Jacob. And then we get this. And now it came to pass that when Moroni had said these words, he went forth, and also sent forth in all the parts of the land where there were dissensions, and gathered together all the people who were desirous to maintain their liberty, to stand against Amalickiah, and those who had dissented, who were called Amalekiahites. And it came to pass that when Amalickiah saw that the people of Moroni were more numerous than the Amalekiahites, and he also saw that his people were doubtful concerning the justice of the cause in which they had undertaken. Some of them are wondering about this whole tyranny thing. Therefore, fearing that he should not gain the point, he took those of his people who would, and departed into the land of Nephi. Right, and that's where we're going to end. So this great new figure, Captain Moroni, comes up at the age of 25, 26. An incredible military leader and an even more incredible spiritual leader who draws on his legacy as an Ephraimite and Manassehite, as a Josephite, in making this covenant with his people and referencing back to their father, their patriarch Joseph, and his coat of many colors as they make this covenant, this karat berit, to stand fast and firm in Christ and to defend their liberty. I'll talk to you next time.